So this presentation is about understanding learning styles and how you can use that information to differentiate instruction, particularly using a tool called format. If you've not already done so, part of the module that's associated with this recording asks you to complete two different types of surveys. One is a learning type measurement, which would, after completing that survey, indicate which learning style you most use as a learner. Oftentimes what you'll see is after completing the measurement that there will be two very close, and we'll talk about that here in just a few moments. Also, the second is a doing and thinking survey, or a doer or thinker survey. This survey primarily indicates which hemisphere of the brain you are most comfortable using. So if you haven't completed the learning type measurement or the doer or thinker survey, at this point I would suggest just pausing this presentation and completing those. Now that you've completed both surveys, it's kind of time to make sense of what all of that information means. From this slide, you can see, and you probably could reference this also from the two different surveys, there's some categories. So from the learning type measurement, and this may be a bit oversimplification, but I think it's important when we get ready to try to use this information as part of our instructional differentiation. There are four primary learning categories. Type 1, which is the concrete learner. That would be the circle. Like if you had the high score on your measurement, that was the circle, then you would primarily be a type 1 learner. A type 2 learner, which is the conceptual learner, that would have been the square on the measurement. The type 3 is the experiential learner, which is the triangle, and the type 4 is the creative learner. In our next slide, we'll speak more directly about what each one of these learning styles means, what in regards to instruction best enhances that particular learning style, what they dislike, etc. Now in the doer or thinker survey, if you scored a plus 12 to a plus 2, then you are primarily a right-brained thinker, meaning that you think very well in the abstract. Oftentimes we consider these creative thinkers or people who are very artistic, etc. If you are a minus 12 through a minus 2, then you are primarily a left-brained thinker, meaning that you're very analytical. You see this oftentimes in the hard sciences, mathematics. And if you found yourself in between a minus 2 and a plus 2, then that would be a holistic thinker, meaning that you're really comfortable using either hemisphere of your brain. So what I would ask you to do now is from the module, what is your learning style? Access the format reading packet, because now we're going to try to make sense of this in regards to how to plan for differentiation using this information. So when we consider format, and I don't want you to make a mistake here, format is just a product that has been created in an effort to help teachers or ministers or whomever plan for differentiation. And it is something that really needs to be considered as we prepare or plan our lesson plans. So if you look at the wheel, and this is how format is oftentimes broken into a pattern of a wheel, you'll see that each learner or each style of learning, type 1, 2, 3, and 4, is categorized, and then it is broken into right brain and left brain. And there's a little bit of a language, words that kind of pinpoint like a type 1 right brain thinker wants to engage in a particular experience. Meaning that for them to learn best, they really need to be hands-on and engaged in whatever it is that you're going to ask them to do. You see this a lot in classrooms, or used to see it a lot in classrooms. You don't see it as much in higher education because I think we've sometimes dismissed this as elementary, or not something that we need to be doing when we're high-level thinkers, and that's not necessarily the case at all, because I would assume if we did a survey from the course, there are several of you who are type 1 learners, and you would very much benefit from this level of connection. I use some examples that we've done in class, like for instance, the pair and share. When we do something and I ask you to turn to a partner and discuss that, that would be very appealing for a type 1 right brain thinker. With that in mind, what's usually appealing for one learner is unappealing for other learners, and we can talk about that as we move around the wheel. I'm not going to necessarily give you a specific example for each category. You can read about that in the reading packet. There's a section of the reading packet that discusses what a type 1 learner is comfortable doing and then what a type 1 learner is uncomfortable doing. Now, the caveat here, if we go back to Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Piaget would suggest that the learner learns best when they are in an uncomfortable setting, meaning that there is discourse or dissonance or disequilibration with their thinking, and that allows them to re-equilibrate. Of course, that oftentimes is done with the help of the instructor. So if we move around to type 2, for instance, the conceptual learner, these are often people who, for instance, from this presentation, they probably get more from a presentation like this. This is not something that is appealing to many styles of learning, but the type 2 learner, or oftentimes what we see in a traditional higher ed classroom, lectures or stimulating conversations, the type 2 learner can learn best from those. And oftentimes they don't have to write anything down. They can remember from those moments, whereas a lot of times the other types of learners would need to write something down in order to be able to get anything out of that. Now, I will say that the type 2 right brain thinker was at one point very rare. To visualize a concept, a very high-level concept, sometimes is very difficult. But however, with the media that we have and technology that we have at our disposal today, particularly YouTube, the type 2 right-brained thinker is a bit more prevalent. For instance, if I wanted to change the water pump on an automobile, the type 2 right-brained thinker could watch the YouTube video and probably feel confident in their ability to be able to do that. So they're visualizing the concept of changing the process of changing that water pump, or whatever it may be. It can be abstract as well. So with our technology today, that type 2 right brain thinker is a bit more prevalent. Now, the type 3 is the type of learner who wants to understand how to use the information they're learning. The experiential learner, or the learner that wants to apply the concepts, the experiences. So these are people, like if you're left brain, these are oftentimes the very good test takers. So we talk about, hey, this person's a really good test taker. Well, that type 3 left brain person is probably that person, because they see a lot of connections with the concepts and the experiences with which they've engaged. And now they are taking that and putting it down on whether it be an essay or whether it be a paper and pencil test or whatever. They are practicing with that information. The type 3 right brain is more of I'll give you an example, someone who's in a science lab. That experimentation in the science lab is the extended learning. So that type 3 right-brained thinker, not to say that there's not left-brain thinking going on in a science lab, but that's the one where they're hands-on, kind of like that type 1 right brain. except the difference here is type 1 is at a concrete level, whereas type 3 is at an experiential level. So they're taking the information and they're applying it. Now the type 4 is the learner that really, if we go back to Bloom's taxonomy, and if you go to the assignment, the differentiated instructional sequence, you'll see a circle there, which I don't want you to get that circle confused with the format circle, but that circle really does a good job of outlining and categorizing Bloom's taxonomy. The highest level of the highest level of thinking should be create. However, this is the one where we find less time in our classrooms to appeal to this learning style. This is where you really need to get out of the way of the student and allow them a tremendous amount of choice in developing whatever it is that you're asking them to develop. And this gets a little bit scary if we go back and connect it to our behaviorism versus constructivism conversation. This is where a lot of times teachers have to relinquish control of the classroom and hand it over to the students, and that means that you better have some really clear goals, and you should have some really clear goals and classroom procedures in place so that that type of learning can be enhanced. But it takes a while for the creative learner to kind of develop what it is they want to do. And you can imagine, it's interesting, if you look at the wheel, what's on the opposite side of that number. For instance, the type 1 learner, type 3 is on the opposite side, and then the type 2 learner and type 4 is on the opposite side. I don't think it's meant to be this way in the wheel. Matter of fact, the idea of the wheel is that you're going to go and hit all of these learning styles, not that you're just going to camp out in one particular area. However, what's across from that number is usually kind of what you might consider the antithesis of that style. For instance, if you're a conceptual learner, the person that's probably the most uncomfortable when you feel comfortable is the type 4 learner. And if you're a type 3 learner, the learner that probably feels the most uncomfortable when you feel comfortable is the type 1 learner. So the style itself is a unique learning capacity. However, that does not mean that you can't transition, and oftentimes that's what we're asking our students to do, is try to transition as we move students around the wheel. The key is to plan to move students around the wheel. And our next slide kind of speaks to that more directly. Again, as I mentioned, format is oftentimes represented in a wheel. Now, this one's a bit more detailed than the previous wheel on the previous slide. I want you to look at this more specifically. It still does break it up similarly in type 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it breaks it also into right mode and left mode. However, if you notice the darkened triangles towards the center of the circle, I think those are extremely important. Like, for instance, type 1 learners are focused on learning that enhances themselves, that this relates to them. We talk about authentic learning experiences, and type 1 has to experience that kind of emotional and affective aspect of learning. So type 1, this is where it very much benefits them. Now, if you transition down to the bottom where it talks about the 2 and 3, and I will suggest you'll see on the sides of the wheel where I say traditional emphasis in red font. This is where we, particularly in secondary, I think we're all guilty of it, even in early childhood sometimes, but all the way certainly in higher ed, is we just camp out in the content. That we present concepts, we assess you on concepts, and then we start a new concept. And when we assess that concept, then we start a new concept. So really, we're not hitting but a mere fraction of the actual learning styles, not even right brain or left brain. A lot of times we're focused on type 2 left brain and type 3 left brain, and then back to type 2 left brain and then type 3 left brain. So we are missing in instruction a huge number of learning styles. And you can speak to that yourself, because if you've taken the survey, unless you were a type 2 left brain or a type 3 left brain, you probably totally understand what I'm saying. In that, yeah, I've been in a lot of classrooms where I felt uncomfortable and uh, unengaged because of what was going on. However, you made it work, and that's because you've shifted to a different learning style. I mentioned earlier, if you took the learning type measurement, oftentimes you have two high numbers, one that's probably your highest number, and then one that's a very close second. And typically what that means is that you wanted to take the learning measurement based on how you naturally learn. Now, that may be your high number. Your highest number on that learning type measurement may be how you naturally learn. Your second highest number is going to be how you have learned how to learn. In other words, it is your conditioned learning. Oftentimes, that would be, as you know, sometimes we call it playing the game, trying to figure out how to make an A in a class based on how a professor does stuff. And you can say, well, that's not necessarily my learning style. We never get to engage in self-experiences. We never really get to experiment with anything, and we certainly don't get to create with anything. However, I'm going to make an A, so I'm going to shift my learning to be a type 2 left brain or a type 3 left brain. You see this a lot, particularly in college, because there are some certainly content areas that suggest performance, music, art, a lot of fine arts will ask this. Certainly teacher education, at some point you're going to have to be out in the field and you're going to have to be practicing and doing things. So the type 3 right brain learner and the type 4, in other words, those are people who embrace the idea of lesson planning and creating their own lessons and implementing those in the classroom. That's the creative learner. So there are programs on campus that transition to the type 3 and the type 4. However, what we want to do is try to hit those things within our coursework as well. It's not just something that has to be reserved for a specific element of the program. Now, as you transition around, you'll notice in the type 4, it's about expression. It's about expressing your gifts. It's about expressing what it is that you've learned at this point. How can you use this information to create something? And it also can be very independent. I'll give you an example of just the assignment, the action research assignment. The action research assignment is that type 1 learner. At first, that's why I think a lot of people look at action research or the assignment that I have in class and think, okay, what in the world? It is designed to hit all of these learning styles. The type 1 learner is going to be the group, the person who best, now that we're kind of virtual, it might be a little bit difficult, but the type 1 learner would be best served when the groups collaborate together and talk about things. That's going to be the learner who can get the most out of it. The type 2, the research, the conceptual understanding of whatever it is that the problem that's trying to be resolved by the group. The type 2 is going to be probably the best at digging through the research. The type 3, writing and formulating, trying to take that information and think in terms of how this information actually solves that problem. And then the type 4 is going to be a lot of times the person that does the last creation, the creation of, and if we were doing this in the action research presentations physically, the type 4 learner would probably get the most out of that as well, because they are expressing what it is that they've learned. So that particular assignment really is designed to involve all of these learning styles. Now, with that said, if you do the intelligences quiz, the multiple intelligences quiz, which is a Howard Gardner theory, you'll see some lap over between these different learning styles and the different intelligences. For instance, the analytical intelligence, the mathematical intelligence, a lot of times that's going to be in a 2 or 3. So it's not going to nicely, neatly fit in. The wheel may be, like I said, a bit of an oversimplification. You always hear the auditory learner. Well, I'm an auditory learner. Well, that can be in a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. Well, I'm a visual learner. Well, that's going to probably be a right-brained thinker, but it could also be a 1, 2, a 3, or 4. So, the human brain and the psychology of this is very interesting, because the brain can transition. However, if we are creating authentic learning moments that help to motivate student learning, as we made some connections prior to this particular presentation, then if you want to make learning authentic or help students develop authentic learning in the classroom, then you're going to have to prepare and plan for the differentiation in your classroom. So if you remember from our terms of the profession that we started with at the beginning of the semester, and I said these terms would be very important as we move forward. Some we've already touched on in regards to student motivation and mindset, but differentiation is, I think, an essential key to learning. And I just included the definition that we began with at the beginning of the semester. It's instruction and production, which is often driven by student choice that engages different learning styles and learning needs. And I will say that you would hear me say this quite often if we were together. It would be student choice equals differentiation. If you're allowing students a choice in the learning activities, then there's a great chance that students are able to differentiate for their learning needs. I often say that you can't teach differentiate. You can't teach something you yourself don't understand. So you can't help your students differentiate if you yourself don't understand differentiation. So a couple of key questions that I'll leave us with as we move forward and think about our differentiated instructional sequences. Number one, how can we plan for differentiation? Simplistically, until you get good at it, that's the reason I introduced the format wheel. The format wheel, I think, is a very concrete way, a type 1 learning opportunity, to plan for differentiation. Think about what all these different learners in your classroom like to do and what they dislike to do. Moving them around the wheel. Now, the thing about using the format can be that wheel can be used in one class sequence. In other words, you can move a type 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 within a 55-minute period, which I think is very difficult at the secondary level, but I've seen elementary teachers do it and do it marvelously. And at the secondary level, a lot of times you may not be able to move students from type 1 to type 4 until a 4 or 5 day period. So that lesson plan may be a week-long sequence of learning to move from a type 1. I will say, just from experience, the type 1 activities usually take less than a class period, whereas type 2, you're really trying to give them a lot of information, and 3, experimentation and then creation usually require more time. So that's oftentimes why it's abandoned, is because, well, we just don't have time. I can assure you, if you plan your time and manage your time and prepare for differentiation, you're going to have enough time. Now, you're not going to be able to prevent one learning or one type of learner to think that their time's not being wasted when you're trying to work with another learner. That happens all the time, is that if we're in the creative learning mode for type 4 learner, there's a great chance the type 2 learners are going to, well, this is a huge waste of my time. And you're not ever going to be able to defeat probably that perception of moving students around the wheel to try to get them to own their learning and find significance in it. However, the more you do it, the more that the different learners who feel uncomfortable in those particular modes start to engage nonetheless. Second question, what are learning activities that must be considered for each type of learner? A little bit of a cheat sheet in that reading packet, although they're vague. It does talk about the things that each learner feels most comfortable doing, and then what they feel uncomfortable doing. I gave you a few examples, then used the action research as an example of what we try to do in the class that hits all of those different learning styles. But you've got, what are the activities that we can, I'm not going to go through class and say, hey, this is one that we did that would have been this learning style, etc. I'll give you an example. We did the jurisprudential inquiry where I asked you or gave you certain statements, and you went around the room and decided which area, strongly agree or strongly disagree, best represents your opinion about that. That would have been a type 1 learning activity. So that's an example of some of that. But I would use the reading packet and other information in order to be able to, kind of figure out what activities best reach what type of learner. Third question is, how does differentiation lead to authentic learning? Huge. Remember, we said if you go back and read chapter 3 in your text, a lot of you wrote this in your discussion thread, that authentic learning is a very key to student motivation. It absolutely, a lot of times that means it's student-led learning, and differentiation certainly can enhance that. But again, you've got to prepare for that, and there's going to be mistakes when that happens. And then lastly, would differentiated instruction help motivate students to learn? If we believe that authentic learning is an essential ingredient in helping students become motivated learners, then we have to suggest that differentiated instruction could certainly help lead to student motivation in the classroom. Here's what we said about student motivation, and here's my last words in regards to differentiation in student motivation. True student motivation has to be internal. If it's external, then you're going to probably have a fixed mindset. So true student motivation has to be an intrinsic piece. And differentiated instruction, although it's not the be-all and end-all, it's not the cure for all levels of student motivation, it produces a desire to learn if it's done well. Now, there's the key, is none of us probably in the class right now know how to differentiate at a advanced or mastery level. So that's the point of why we're doing it now, is to experiment with it, figure it out, but carry it into our classrooms or whatever it is that we're planning on doing, ministry, counseling, carry it with us so that we know that, look, there are these different learners in our classes. There are these different learners in our congregations. There are these different learners in our clinics. And for me to truly engage these people, I have to think in terms of what it is that they engage with. And so if you don't prepare for it, you can be accidental. You can differentiate accidentally. I've certainly done that as a teacher. But to be intentional about it, your classes will be much more dynamic and the students will certainly engage more. But like I said, the caveat is that you will always have that one learner who doesn't see the value in what it is that you're doing. And that's really an affective thing rather than cognitive thing, is that, going back to connecting to prior learning, affective and cognitive are not exclusive. So, that's fine. Not every learner has to see the value in what it is that you're doing. That doesn't mean that they can't learn from it. So just ask the type 4 learners who have for years had to try to figure out how to learn like a type 2 learner. They've seen school oftentimes probably as an obstacle rather than something that is enhancing for their learning. So sometimes when you reverse that, the type 2 learner is going to think the same thing. So with that, I want you to ponder these questions as you go and move into developing your differentiated instructional sequence, because I think this makes us better teachers.